In one sense, Seoul is Korea. These were the words written by the British explorer Isabella Bird Bishop in the year 1894 in the fourth chapter of her book Korea and Her Neighbors, after she visited the country in the late 19th century. She went on to further state that, to quote, "Whatever of national life there is exists only in the capital," and that, to quote, "The heart of every Korean is in Seoul." And if this was indeed the case back in 1894, did anything change in the modern Korean landscape in the year 2023 after more than a century of time has passed since Bird visited Korea? Unfortunately, it does not seem to be the case. This is a map of South Korea, and this map is a cartogram of the area distorted in proportion to the population of each region. And as you can see, the statement, "Seoul is Korea" by Isabella Bird in 1894 still very much applies to the modern Korean scene as well, perhaps even more so now than it was in the past. So why did such dangerous levels of centralization occur in South Korea, where the make or break of the entire nation has to be solely relied on the well-being of one single city only 23 kilometers away from the North Korean border? And in what exact ways is the Seoul centralization issue of South Korea potentially so detrimental for the future of the nation? Let's find out in today's video. Let's first get one thing clear. It is not entirely uncommon for most of the economic, political, social, educational, and cultural activities of the nation to be centralized in the nation's capital city. However, the degree in which this is occurring in South Korea is to the utmost extreme. Around 51% of the entire population of South Korea, or around 26 million people, currently live within the boundaries of the Seoul-Incheon metropolitan area. In comparison, around 7% of the entire population of Germany, or approximately 6.2 million people, live in the Berlin metropolitan area. Even in nations such as France, where it is widely acknowledged that the population is heavily concentrated around its capital city, 15% of its entire population, or about 13 million people, lives within the Paris region. While not small, the 15% figure still definitely sounds a lot milder compared to South Korea's 51% population concentration ratio to the nation's capital city. The United Kingdom is a bit more centralized than France, with about 21% or around 14 million people living in the London metropolitan area. 35% of the entire population of Japan currently lives in the Tokyo-Yokohama metropolitan area, still not coming close to Seoul's 51%. In fact, the only country in the world right now that has a comparable population ratio that is concentrated in the nation's capital city relative to South Korea is Mongolia, with 47% of the total population living in the country's capital of Ulaanbaatar. So, in all fairness, South Korea's Seoul centralization problem is not something that one just can look and say, "Look, it's no big deal. Things are centered around London in the UK, Paris in France, Tokyo in Japan," as the problem is far greater and poses far more potential danger to South Korea than what many abroad currently evaluate as. Let us first look into some history and see just exactly from when, as Isabella Bird has said, the heart of every Korean came to be in Seoul. After 474 years of rule, the Goryeo Kingdom of Korea met its end after General Lee Seung-Ge led a successful coup d'etat and became the founder and first ruler of the new Joseon dynasty of Korea in 1392, becoming King Taejo of Joseon. And with the founding of the Joseon dynasty, the city of Seoul, named Hanseong back during the Joseon dynasty, became the capital of Korea in the year 1394, when King Taejo moved the capital to Hanseong from Gyeong. And since then, Seoul has played the role of the center and largest city of the Korean peninsula for more than 600 years until today. And as I often state in many of our videos, everything starts from the people. So in that sense, what is driving this long-lasting obsession of the Korean people towards Seoul? Many historians point out the element of greed for power and authority by the Korean aristocracy class, or the Yangban class of the Joseon dynasty, as a core factor which led to the Hanseong or Seoul centralization in the pre-modern period of Korea. One famous illustration of this is in Chung Yak-yong's Happy Chop in 1810. Chung Yak-yong was one of the most influential philosophers in Korea in the late Joseon period, who was a close friend with the King Jeongjo and held many important administrative positions. And Happy Chop were letters of advice on life in which he wrote for his two sons during his time in exile. And in Happy Chop, he wrote the following for his sons: to quote, only plan to live within 10 li, which is 4 kilometers in the metric system, from Seoul. If you cannot afford to live within the city walls, then live in the outskirts of Seoul, then move into the center of Seoul in the future. If you are to go outside of the 4 walls, all opportunities will disappear. And although the current size of Seoul has expanded beyond that of the initial Seoul walled city back in the Joseon Dynasty days, the words said by Jang Hyuk-yong apply just as much to the current people living in the modern times as much as how it applied in the past. Millions of young people who are not Seoul natives come to Seoul every year for the psychological reason of ambition towards success, whether it be attending the best universities and receiving the best education in which Korea has to offer, or whether it be getting a high-paying job. So just like how migratory birds are programmed to migrate, in the minds of the Koreans, people are programmed to move to Seoul if they are to even have the slightest of ambition towards success and worldly achievement. Unfortunately, a lot of the psychological elements that are ingrained in the Korean culture psychology are just very much a given for me, and it is often hard for me to evaluate the collective psychology of Koreans, as I am a Korean myself, making it hard for me to literally take a step outside of myself and provide an objective third-person analysis of many of the aspects of the Korean culture psychology, as they often just seem so natural and it's just ingrained as a very part of who I am, leading me to not question why many of the psychological elements of the Koreans are the way they are. So in that sense, I'll never be able to write a book titled The Secrets of the Korean Mind. However, after more than a decade of experience living in Japan and being stunned every day on how the mindset of the people who live less than 600 miles across the sea from Korea have such polar opposites of cultural psychology from the people of his neighboring country, I have came to write the book, The Secrets of the Japanese Mind. So if you'd like to read the most thorough book on the Japanese culture psychology that is out in the world right now, without the political correctness nonsense and getting straight into the raw core truth of the matter, please consider purchasing our book. You will also be greatly supporting the channel and help Helen and I create content such as the one of today's video as well. Thank you. But with that said, back to the video. And after the collapse of the Joseon Dynasty and the subsequent period of the Japanese rule from 1910 to 1945, things did move slightly towards Seoul decentralization. This is as during the period of the Japanese colonial rule, ports for trade such as exporting rice were built in the southern provinces of Korea, and at the latter years of the colonial rule, which overlaps with the time of the Second World War, a lot of policy and infrastructure building focus was implemented towards Manchuria and the northern regions of the Korean peninsula. And as the war continued, with much of the action being taken in the northern regions of Korea rather than the south, there was indeed substantial movement of the population to the northern parts of the Korean peninsula, with a lot of industrial development occurring in the region. But the Japanese still based the heart of their colonial governance in Seoul. And to ease the process of the governance, they let out various policies which led to discrimination against all dialects in Korea other than the Seoul dialect. This definitely did seem to have an impact on the psychology of the people in Korea at the time, as famous poets and thinkers of the time such as Ju-Han and Eum-Seop and Choi Man-sik left quotes such as, "Artists from Pyongyang need to conduct their cultural activities in Seoul rather than Pyongyang. My hometown of Yeongnam has limited vocabulary and the pronunciation is not accurate. The region just does not have a sophistication of language required for great literary works. Using non-Seoul dialect in your work shows lack of sophistication." So while there was a degree of temporary decentralization away from Seoul during the times of the Japanese colonial period for practical reasons of the time, such as war mobilization and trade, the fact that Seoul still symbolized the heart and height of civilization in Korea remained much unchanged during the early 20th century of the Japanese colonial rule as well. Fun fact, this obsession towards Seoul is not only limited to the South Koreans, but for the North Koreans as well. The North Korean regime had an article in the constitution which declared Seoul as the capital city of North Korea all the way until 1972. And after Korea was liberated from the Japanese rule, many flocked to Seoul in the hopes of taking the large quantity of jobs that were previously occupied by the Japanese. Similar pattern occurred as well after the end of the Korean War in 1953, as large numbers of people with lower standard of living from the north migrated to the south, mostly concentrating towards the city areas such as Seoul, where there was larger numbers of work available for them. Now, Seoul was not the only city in South Korea which saw a large increase in the number of its inhabitants. Busan, which was the temporary capital city of South Korea during the Korean War, and is still the second largest city of South Korea in terms of population to this day, also experienced significant growth in its population after the war, largely owing to the fact that the city held the largest trading port in South Korea. So quite naturally, with Seoul and Busan being the two largest and most important cities of South Korea in terms of playing a pivotal role for the nation's economic recovery, there were large efforts made by the newly implemented post-war South Korean government to develop a transportation network connecting the two cities. Thus, the Gyeongbu Railway Line, which was the first railway line of South Korea connecting the southern and northern regions of the nation, underwent major development, as well as the Gyeongbu Expressway for automobile transportation. And with the Gyeongbu Expressway especially being symbolized as the quote-unquote artery of the country, regional economic development mainly occurred around areas near the Gyeongbu Line and the Gyeongbu Expressway, meaning that regions that were not close to these two major transportation networks were left much neglected economically, once again leading to heavy outflow of the local population in such regions to the city areas, accelerating to the Seoul centralization phenomenon. But then this leads to the subsequent question. If Seoul and Busan played a pivotal role for South Korea's post-war economic recovery, and both had similar levels of growth in its population in the 1960s and 1970s, how come the city of Busan as of now has a population that is only around 35% of that of Seoul? In order to find the answer to this question, we have to look into the history of policymaking which was conducted in the growth years of South Korea during the latter half of the 20th century. Until the 1970s, the Yeongnam area, which is the regional name for the southeastern part of South Korea that includes the city of Busan, did have a strong share in economic power in industries such as the light industry and the heavy chemical industry. But beginning from the 1980s, major corporations based in the Yeongnam region were faced with a heavy set of growth restraint policies by the government, at the time ruled by Chun Doo-hwan, who was a military dictator whose conduct during his dictatorship is still largely criticized by the Korean people to this day. And some of the actions in which President Chun took in order to restrain the growth of corporations based around the Busan region was truly drastic and is considered highly controversial still to this day. Such were actions such as forcefully dissolving Busan-based chaebol conglomerates such as the Gukje Group or the Dongmyeon Group. Dongmyeon Group, for instance, was the single largest chaebol corporation of South Korea in 1965, and was initially much larger in size compared to other famous Korean chaebol conglomerates that people know of today, such as the Samsung Group and the Hyundai Group. Now, the surface reason for dissolving these Busan-based conglomerates was that they were conducting excessive corporate expansion with poor oversight, and to balance the distribution of economic growth more equally around South Korea. But the current analysis that holds most validity is that Busan-based conglomerate groups such as the Gukje Group did not pay enough political bribery to the Chun military regime compared to that of other conglomerate groups, leading to much resentment by the president of the time. So with Busan-based conglomerates such as the Gukje Group and the Dongmyeon Group that was once the biggest conglomerate group ahead of Samsung and others undergoing dissolution by the military regime of the time, the region of Busan itself also experienced heavy limitations in the area's economic development. But while all of this was happening in the second most populous city of South Korea, the area around the Seoul metropolitan area was still undergoing rapid economic development, culminating to an irreversible economic gap between Seoul and other regions of South Korea by the time the 2000s have approached. So in what specific ways is the Seoul centralization phenomenon of South Korea problematic for the nation? There is indeed quite a large number of problems that are partly or wholly associated with Seoul centralization, but let's go over some of the most prominent ones. Let us first talk about the economy. Areas in Seoul such as the Nowon district, largely regarded over the years as the more lower-class neighborhood of Seoul, effectively surpassed in average real estate prices by the late 2010s to that of the most sought-after upper-class areas of Busan such as Udon in the Haeundae district. This type of abnormal discrepancy in real estate prices between the Seoul and non-Seoul areas of South Korea is currently contributing to the increase in wealth discrepancy between the Seoul and the non-Seoul residents of South Korea. In simple words, people who owns land in Seoul continuing from the past keeps getting richer and richer, while the people who owns land outside of Seoul continues to get relatively poorer and poorer. The South Korean government over the years have tried to alleviate this phenomenon by subsidizing non-Seoul based local construction companies to build apartments in the respective regions in order to promote more economic activity around the area, with more people hopefully moving to these apartments. However, many claim that such actions that were taken in fact exacerbated the decrease in real estate prices in the non-Seoul areas of South Korea, as while the supply of apartments outside of Seoul has increased without the creation of essential needs for people to move to these areas, such as the creation of jobs, hospitals, and educational institutions. There was effectively no demand for most people to move to these newly built apartments in the non-Seoul areas. So this type of drastic difference in real estate price development between Seoul and the non-Seoul regions currently prevailing in South Korea is creating a form of modern-day class system similar to the days of back in the Joseon dynasty, with the landowners located in Seoul accumulating levels of wealth incomparable to that of residents in the non-Seoul regions. If you work hard and create jobs, it will just be sucked in by Seoul, like a black hole. All of our people, all of our culture, all of our students, and all of our property. This is a statement made by Kim Kwan-young, the former governor of North Gyeongsang province of South Korea, during a speech campaigning and urging for balanced regional development. And as the governor Kim Kwan-young has said, regardless of how much each of the local regions work towards creating jobs in their areas, much of the work and job created has a tendency to eventually be relocated to the Seoul region. So why is this the case? There is a combination of practical reasons as well as psychological reasons associated with the mindset possessed by the generality of the Korean people which contributes to this phenomenon. First, it is probably without having to be said that almost all of the chaebol conglomerates of South Korea that runs the nation's economy have their headquarters based in Seoul. As of 2023, only 3 of the 10 biggest chaebols in South Korea, based on market capitalization, have their headquarters based outside of Seoul, which are Samsung, Hyundai Heavy Industries, and POSCO. But while Samsung Group's head office is technically located in Suwon, Gyeonggi District, this area is still largely considered as a part of the Seoul metropolitan area. Furthermore, the Samsung chairman's office is still located in Samsung Town at Seochogu, which is located at the very heart of Seoul. Same applies to other large conglomerates that have their headquarters located outside of Seoul, such as Hyundai Heavy Industries and POSCO, as although they may have their headquarters technically located outside of Seoul on paper, they all have placed head offices in Seoul through the creation of holding companies. This is in quite a stark contrast to other OECD nations such as the United States, where almost every state has a headquarters of a sizable corporation. The same applies to Japan, as while things are indeed centralized to an extent towards Tokyo in Japan, the levels are nowhere as near as that of Seoul centralization, with the headquarters of large Japanese corporations being relatively dispersed throughout the nation. Such non-Tokyo-based Japanese corporations are Toyota, Aeon, Nissan, Panasonic, Denso, and Suzuki, to name a few. And China, while not technically an OECD nation, still has a situation better than South Korea in terms of successfully avoiding centralization of all things towards the nation's capital city, as cities such as Shanghai and Hong Kong have as much, if not more, economic influence on the nation compared to that of Beijing. So with all the head offices of major South Korean corporations being located in Seoul, people in South Korea oftentimes have no option but to live within Seoul purely as a result of the physical location of their jobs. But then, with South Korea being home to many manufacturing giants such as Samsung, LG, and Hyundai, they cannot obviously create all of their large-scale factories and manufacturing facilities in Seoul with its limited land space and abnormally risen land prices. So, quite naturally, while these huge corporations have their headquarters based in Seoul, a lot of them have their actual manufacturing facilities located in the countryside regions of South Korea. So then, does this not mean that as these large-scale manufacturing facilities are located outside of Seoul, people who work at these manufacturing facilities have to move and live in these non-Seoul regions as their jobs are located there? The answer to this question is yes and no. While there is definitely a part of the population of South Korea who decide to move to these non-Seoul regions as a result of their job location, much of the working population in South Korea are still absolutely adamant about living in Seoul and still technically working for the Seoul-based headquarters of their respective companies, even if it means that they have to take 16 business trips a month back and forth between Seoul and the distant manufacturing facility. But then, why do this? Why make life so hard for yourself? Why not just live in the non-Seoul-based area where you attend most of your work anyways? This again can go back to the earlier parts of the video, and how since the days of the Joseon dynasty, Seoul was considered as the only place you had to be able to be considered as an individual who lived a civilized life and is the heart of all things in South Korea. In essence, To be considered as part of society and to be considered as an individual who actually held somewhat of an important position in society, you had to live in Seoul. And through the phenomenon of path dependence, which means that institutions, structures, and standards that were created in the past continues to be used even though you may not be the most optimal in current conditions and climate, Seoul is indeed still regarded by most South Koreans as the only place where they can have a successful life and career. And not all of this is from path dependence and relics from the past, but the hard and cold practical reality still for much of the working population. This is because in the Korean work culture, there is the prevalent conception in the corporate atmosphere that being assigned to a non-Seoul-based company office effectively means demotion or an end of one's career. So for many of the South Koreans, being asked by the head office to relocate and work at the non-Seoul-based office means that the company wants to get rid of you and is thus an indirect way of asking you to resign or retire. So with such a predominant mindset permeating throughout the Korean work atmosphere, many South Koreans, even if them being sent to a non-Seoul regional office, is not in any way associated with demotion and purely stems from a practical, logistic reasons for the company, will still adamantly refuse to be relocated to the non-Seoul-based office, even if it means that they have to quit working for the company and transfer to another. So all of these factors leads to a vicious cycle where all jobs in South Korea become mostly concentrated to Seoul, and even if there are job creations in other regions of the country, nobody wants to really work in such regions due to the social stigma attached to such relocation to work in the non-Seoul regions and the negative impact it will have on their careers. This then leads companies to create even the factories and manufacturing facilities to as near as Seoul as possible, as in, while it may be impossible to construct a sizable manufacturing facility within Seoul, they still attempt to build it in the suburb outskirt regions that is as close as possible to the Seoul metropolitan area, again neglecting the development of regions of South Korea that are physically distant from this all-powerful city. We cannot discuss the negative ramifications in which Seoul's centralization phenomenon is bringing to South Korea without discussing its effects on the nation's birth rate. South Korea has the most unprecedentedly low birth rates in the entire world right now. And I believe a lot of people just don't realize the sheer magnitude of the low birth rate problem of South Korea right now. For example, many say that the Japanese people are not having kids and that the nation suffers from low birth rates. However, Japan still has a birth rate of 1.34 average birth per woman. Then wait till you hear the numbers for South Korea. As of 2022, the birth rate of South Korea is 0.75, which means that while people are worrying out there about how the people in Japan are not having kids and the nation faces a potential population collapse, its neighboring country, South Korea, is just there silently having birth rate that is almost half of that of Japan's. Not just a little bit lower, but almost half. And how dangerous levels of Seoul centralization is contributing to this is as follows. In the rural areas, the prospect of maintaining healthy levels of residing population in such regions in South Korea is obviously almost non-existent, as the younger population all move to Seoul to make money. And the people who do stay or move to the rural areas of South Korea are almost all male, as the only types of jobs that are left in the rural areas are not office jobs but manual labor jobs, such as in factories and manufacturing facilities or in farming, which prefers male workforce, as well as with most of the working female population not preferring such manual jobs. And obviously, a man and another man cannot biologically give birth to a child, meaning that even the small number of male population residing in the rural areas cannot contribute to maintaining the country's population. But then, does this mean that the residing population in Seoul actively participate in marriage and have kids? Not at all. I believe much of the people watching this video already know about the fact that urban population, both male and female, tend to be more career-driven and marry at a later age compared to that of the rural population. Combine that with abnormal housing prices in Seoul due to its high demand and low supply, much of the working population in their 20s and 30s do not have the adequate financial resources to buy or rent a house to start a family. And also with abundance of leisure and recreational activities that are available in the city of Seoul, many prefer to remain single as a combination of all of these factors and do not consider the prospect of marriage. And fair enough if such urban population who are not interested in marriage or do not have the financial resources to get married is only a manageable portion of the population. But when more than 51% of the entire population of South Korea is such an urban population, it subsequently leads to such unprecedentedly low birth rates never seen in the history of modern humanity of 0.75 births per woman. So many experts and demographers of South Korea, such as Professor Cho Young-tae of Seoul National University, raised their serious concerns of how, in order for South Korea to avoid the potential possibility of having its population decrease to the point of near extinction in a few hundred years of time, one of the most fundamental actions in which the nation has to take is to slow down the process of Seoul centralization. And there are much more problems that could be discussed in which are partially or wholly connected to the Seoul centralization phenomenon, such as its negative effects on national security due to the city's proximity to the North Korean border, medical and health risks posed to the generality of the South Korean population, with all major hospitals and medical infrastructure being centralized in Seoul, leading so much of the older population in the rural regions facing death without the opportunity for proper treatment, serious environmental issues such as the problem of garbage disposal that is naturally associated with having more than 51% of the population of a nation living within a tiny metropolitan area, terrible living standards of inhabitants living within Seoul both physically due to tiny living spaces, garbage and pollution issues, as well as psychologically with inhumane levels of competition to make it in society all within the walls of this tiny city. And if the time comes, we'd love to make more specific videos on each of these problems. But if we are to discuss all of these problems in depth all in this one video, the video would have to be like 3 hours long. So for now, please understand the fact that we won't be able to cover all of the problems associated to Seoul centralization in depth. Now, I know that if this video is to indeed gather some degree of views, there will be at least one omniscient commenter who write a comment in the lines of, "The answer is not so difficult, the solution is this and this, end of story." And such types of simple answers do indeed exist when we search the solutions for solving the Seoul centralization problem as well, such as move the capital city, or build more infrastructure in the rural areas, or promote balanced regional growth. But for the people who have thoroughly watched this rather long video, you already know that such solutions that are presented are much more easier said than done due to so many physical, social, cultural, and psychological reasons that uniquely applies to the Korean people on such a deep level. So for the time being, same as in 1894, the heart of every Korean remains to be in Seoul. And where this nation of Republic of Seoul, commonly known as the Republic of Korea, will head with such hefty dependency to one single city, we will have to wait and see.